11 young men who died in the Great War are commemorated on Drayton's unusual thatched war memorial. It remembers 2 brothers, the publican's son, and 2 who'd recently emigrated. The youngest to die was just 19. These are their stories.
Herbert Alford.
Herbert was the son of cattleman James and Sarah Alford. They lived in North Street. His youngest brother, Frank, served with the Royal Army Medical Corps. Charles, who was 4 years older, was a gunner who won the Military Medal for acts of gallantry and devotion to duty under fire.
Herbert was with the 7th Battalion Somerset Light Infantry, formed in 1914 as part of Lord Kitchener's army. He and his wife Louisa had a son, Fred, who was born in 1911. In October 1916, Herbert was in action at the Battle of Le Transloy, part of the Somme offensive.
It was a period of fighting in terrible weather, in which the heavy, clinging, chalky Somme mud and the freezing, flooded battlefield became as formidable an enemy as the Germans.
The Langport Herald, October the 21st, 1916.
On Saturday last, Mrs. Alford was officially notified that her husband, Trooper H. Alford, had been killed in action. Much sympathy is expressed with Mrs. Alford in her sad bereavement. On Sunday at the parish church, the vicar, the Reverend F.W. Soames, made feeling allusion to the sad event.
Herbert had died on October the 7th. His name is recorded on the Thiepval Memorial, one of 72,000 men who fell in the Somme sector who have no known grave. He was 28 years old. His second son was born 4 months later.
Richard Percival Dominat.
Richard Dominat, known as Reggie, was the son of Fred and Elizabeth Dominat, who were publicans at the Crown Inn. He would have been 16 at the outbreak of war, so too young to enlist then, but in June 1917 he was in Flanders at the Battle of Messines.
It began with the detonation of 19 mines beneath the German front position, which devastated the German front-line defences and left 19 large craters. This was followed by a creeping barrage 700 yards deep, protecting the British troops as they secured the ridge with support from tanks, cavalry patrols and aircraft.
On Thursday morning, Mrs. F. Dominat received the sad news that her son, Private Reggie Dominat of the Somerset, had been killed in action. The young man, who was well known in the village, had only been in the army about 5 months and was 19 years of age. Much sympathy is extended to Mrs. Dominat.
He'd been killed on the first day of the battle. His name is recorded on the Menin Gate at Ypres in Belgium, a second Drayton man to die in the war with no known grave. To this day, the last post is sounded every night at the Menin Gate.
William Guillard. William Guillard was the son of the coachman at Midley Place. He grew up at Gate Cottage on the impressive estate built by the Seeley Trevilians in the middle of the 19th century on the Curry rival edge of Drayton.
He'd started work on the estate as a groom and had worked his way up to a trusted position as a footman and valet. He was 27 when he enlisted in August 1915 and joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. In 1917, he was stationed in Salonika, now Thessalonica, in Greece, where there was an Allied base set up for operations against pro-German Bulgaria. On August the 30th, he found himself admitted to the hospital where he worked with a temperature of 104 and an intense headache. The diagnosis was malaria. By the evening of September the 3rd, his medical case sheet reports that he was going downhill, his pulse weaker. He was administered quinine and brandy.
A telegram had already been sent to Mr. Guillard at Gate Cottage, telling him that William was in a critical condition. He died in the early hours of September the 4th.
The late Private Guillard was for many years valet to the late Mr. E.B. Seeley Trevelyan of Midley Place. He was of a most genial and courteous nature and was a general favourite in the village. The greatest sympathy is extended to Mr. Guillard in the heavy loss that has befallen him. Private Guillard did not wait for any form of compulsion, but volunteered his services at an early stage of the war, and has now died after gallantly doing his bit for king and country.
787 British soldiers died of malaria in the Macedonia and Salonika plain between 1916 and the end of the war. William was 30 years old.
Bert Gold.
The Golds had come from High Ham to settle at Middleby, and when Bertie was 12 in 1901, he had already left school and was a ploughboy on the farm where his father was a carter. He enlisted as a private, but obviously showed promise and was promoted to Lance Corporal. In 1917, he was in Palestine, taking part in the Third Battle of Gaza against the Turks of the Ottoman Empire. A very different landscape to leafy Middleby.
The first day of the battle was November the 6th. The Somersets, as part of the 74th Yeomanry Division, reached their starting positions by 3:30 a.m. and launched their attack on the Turkish trenches.
They attacked across burnt grassland without any preliminary artillery bombardment. Several unsuccessful attempts to counterattack the 74th Division were made by Ottoman forces. Nevertheless, the division advanced rapidly.
The noise of incessant rifle fire just beyond the crest showed that our infantry were engaged. Glancing back, I saw that the whole plain was alive with advancing units. The batteries of other brigades, the divisional artillery column, Army Service Corps columns, and camel convoys.
It is with deep regret I write these few lines to inform you of the death from wounds of your son, Lance Corporal B. Gould. He was wounded on November the 6th in an attack on strong Turkish positions. Every man behaved splendidly, making a name for the battalion and the old country. Your son proved himself an efficient NCO, respected by both officers and men. Signed, Lieutenant R. J. Levisham.
Mrs. Gould has received the sad intelligence that her son, Lance Corporal B. Gould of the West Somerset Yeomanry, has died of wounds in Palestine. Letters of sympathy have also been received from the chaplain and his chum, Private W. West. The sympathy of the parishioners is extended to Mrs. Gould in her great loss.
His grave is at the Kantara War Memorial Cemetery, just a few hundred yards east of the Suez Canal. He's the only non-commissioned officer whose name appears on Drayton's War Memorial. The Gould family left Drayton and emigrated to the United States in 1921.
Charles Parsons. Frederick Charles Parsons was a grocer. At 5'6", he weighed just over 8 stone when he enlisted. Not atypical of the physique of enlisting soldiers.
He'd been quick to sign up. His attestation papers are dated September the 5th, 1914, a little over a month from the start of the war.
In July 1915, Mrs. Seeley Trevelyan wrote from Middleby Place to her son, Major Maurice Trevelyan. The Parsons, she said, got to Winchester, where they were met by their son with a car lent to him by an officer. They passed the evening with him and saw him march off next morning with the parting words, "It's the happiest day of my life."
He served with the Royal Field Artillery as a driver, and his time fighting ended 4 months into the Battle of Passchendaele. On October the 29th, 1917, he reported sick with severe stomach pains and an inability to pass water. It was diagnosed as nephritis, a common kidney problem in trench conditions, probably caused by poor diet and the ingestion of toxins. There were 35,000 British casualties due to this during the war.
Charles would have had a very painful journey from Passchendaele to a casualty clearing station, then on to hospital at Boulogne, across the Channel to England and hospital in Portsmouth. later in the Isle of Wight for diagnoses and treatment.
He was finally discharged unfit in August 1918. This steady, sober and industrious soldier's disability being put down to exposure on active service. His intended residence on getting home was noted as East Street, Drayton. He died in December 1918, just months after returning home.
Bert Smith.
Bert and Herbert Smith were brothers. They were part of a big family living at Haywards Way on Law Lane. Both sadly appear on the War Memorial, but at the outbreak of the war, Bert had already emigrated to New Zealand, while Herbert had stayed in Drayton.
Bert was 5'3", with blue eyes and light brown hair. He and his wife Mary lived in Palmerston North on New Zealand's North Island. He is a labourer and enlisted in New Zealand in May 1917, sailing from Wellington.
In the late summer of 1918, the Allies were making good progress recapturing land the Germans had taken in the spring. The 2nd Battalion, Canterbury Regiment of New Zealand Expeditionary Force, were part of an attack with the British on the 24th of August, when they captured the village of Grevillers near Bapaume in northern France.
Troops from all parts of New Zealand have now been in the Great Battle, raging along the British front, and all have acquitted themselves well. For a time, hot fire was poured on the advancing New Zealanders, and they had to take what shelter they could hastily find. Opportunely, a tank came up, and the German machine gunners, who knew too well the habits of those thick-skinned monsters, took to their heels, the Aucklanders and others shooting at them as they ran.
Bert was reported killed in action that day. He's buried at Grevillers British Military Cemetery.
Herbert Smith. Bert's younger brother Herbert worked at Merrick's farm on the outskirts of Langport. He was a waggoner and a quarryman at the quarry near the farm. When conscription was introduced in January 1916, he applied for an exemption. In March, his employer appeared in front of the tribunal hearing his case.
March the 15th, 1916. Mr. Tom Towning of Merrick's Farm, Hewish Episcopi, appealed on behalf of Herbert Smith, a carter of Drayton, whose application had been refused. Appeal dismissed.
He married Emma Mayle from Barrington in the early summer of 1916, and their son Clarence was born in July. We don't know if he saw his son before he left for the Western Front, where he became a driver with the 32nd Division's ammunition column, part of the Royal Field Artillery. His experience as a carter would have stood him in good stead, as his job would have put him in charge of 2 horses, part of a team of 6 horses, that pulled the ammunition wagons to and from the front lines.
In November 1917, he was near Ypres in Belgium, taking part in an offensive against German positions. He died on November the 30th and is buried at Flamartine New Military Cemetery.
Clifford Stone.
Clifford Stone was in Flanders at about the same time. He was one of Harry and Susanna Stone's 2 sons. His elder brother Bert was also serving abroad. Harry Stone is remembered in Drayton as the photographer who took photographs of the village at the end of the 19th century, including this of his son Clifford. In October 1917, Clifford was near Ypres with the 8th Battalion, Devonshire Regiment. The Battle of Passchendaele was underway. Heavy rain throughout August had turned the battlefield to mud. September was drier, but the rain returned on October the 4th, the day Clifford's unit took part in the Battle of Broadsinder. It was to claim his life.
The Langport Herald, October the 22nd, 1917.
Much sympathy is expressed with Mr. and Mrs. Stone in their anxiety with regard to their son, Private Clifford Stone of the Devons, who has been officially reported as having been wounded on the 4th inst, and the War Office saying nothing has been seen of him since. His many friends trust that good news will be received of him soon.
He's buried at the Tyne Cot Cemetery. He was just 19 years old. 100 years on, at the visitor centre, the names of all the soldiers buried in this imposing cemetery are read on a recorded loop.
Bernerd Trot.
Guardsman Bernerd Trot was a professional soldier. He had joined the Grenadier Guards in 1910 when he was 18 and became part of the British Expeditionary Force, the first British troops to arrive in France. The 2nd Battalion, Grenadier Guards, saw some of the fiercest fighting in the early months of the war, including the bloody First Battle of Ypres, after which only 4 officers and 140 men survived of the 1,000 or so strong battalion that had embarked from England in August.
He was awarded the 1914 Star Medal with a class, which indicates that he had served under fire or operated within range of enemy mobile artillery during that time. He saw 2 years of fighting, and in September 1916 he was with his unit on the Gingis-le-Boeuf road at the Battle of Morval, part of the border battle of the Somme.
War Diaries of the 2nd Battalion Grenadier Guards, September 25th, 1916. The morning of September the 25th was a very bad one for us, as the trenches were very narrow and the men shoulder to shoulder, almost unable to sit down. At 12:40, the first objective was gained, with a certain amount of difficulty, as our artillery had entirely failed to cut a single strand of the wire. While the companies were cutting it and making their way through, the Germans picked off almost all of our officers with rifles and caused us some casualties by throwing bombs.
Bernerd Trot is buried in the Guard cemetery at Les Boeufs, a few hundred yards short of the village, with about 40 other officers and men who died in the attack on that day.
Harry Trot.
Harry Trot was the eldest son of George and Charlotte Trot, who lived in Church Street. Harry was a farm labourer who, at the outbreak of the war, had recently emigrated to Canada. He is described as being of medium height, 5 feet 5 inches, and stout when he enlisted in Quebec on March the 7th, 1918, to join the Canadian Overseas Expeditionary Force. The First World War saw the first use of chemical weapons, and 5 months after joining up, it was a chemical attack that claimed his life.
Mr. George Trot has officially been informed that his son, Private Harry Trot of the Canadians, has died of the effects of gas poisoning received in action. His death occurred at a military hospital at Boulogne. Much sympathy is extended to the parents in their sad bereavement.
This newspaper report is dated 2 days before the end of the war, and just 8 months after he signed up for military service in Canada. He is buried in the British cemetery at Wimille, on the outskirts of Boulogne. Ominously, that same edition of the newspaper that reported his death also reported that 17-year-old Louisa Locke had died from influenza. This was the Spanish flu, which was to claim more lives than the war itself in the coming months.
Albert George Vickery.
The Vickerys had come to Drayton from Bridgewater, but by the time Albert was 15, he was living in Drayton with his family, his parents George and Nora, and his brother and 2 sisters. He, like his father, was working as a cowman. He was 17 at the outbreak of the war. In 1917, he was on the Western Front in France.
On Monday, Mr. and Mrs. Vickery received information that their eldest son, Private A.G. Vickery of the Somerset Light Infantry, had died in a military hospital in France on April 23rd from wounds received in action. The news came as a shock to the parents, as they had previously received a field card from their son stating that he had been wounded but that he was progressing favourably. The late Private Vickery, who was 22 years of age, was well known in the village, where he had many friends who sincerely sympathised with the parents in their sad loss. The flag was flown at half-mast on the church tower on Tuesday.
His grave is at the Aubigny Communal Cemetery extension, 8 miles from Arras, where there was an Allied casualty clearing station, a wounded man's first stop after being rescued from the battlefield.
There are 3 other men who aren't on our war memorial in 2018, but are associated with the village. They are
Sergeant Charles Bisgrove.
The 16th Battalion Welsh Regiment was raised in Cardiff in 1914 and did their training at Colwyn Bay. By the summer of 1917, they were taking part in the Battle of Passchendaele. His wife was living in Drayton. Quartermaster Sergeant Williams had sad occasion to write to Mrs. Bisgrove in October.
He died whilst leading the company into action, all the officers having been wounded, and his last words were, "Come on, the Cardiff crowd, give it to them." Your husband was a very popular NCO in the company, and his loss to us is beyond words. Personally, I miss him terribly, as we had soldiered together since joining the battalion at Colwyn Bay and have been side by side through all dangers and perils since we came to France in 1915.
His is one of the names remembered with honour at the Tyne Cot Memorial.
William Adams.
William Adams lived in Drayton at the time he joined the army, having been born in Albrewers. His family had moved around the southwest, probably in search of work. He was serving in Palestine in November and died in the same battle as Bertie Gold on November the 6th, 1917, in the Third Battle of Gaza.
His name is on the Jerusalem Memorial, and he was the holder of the military medal, the second Drayton man to be awarded this medal.
Sidney George Locke.
Sidney was born in Drayton in 1881, and in 1908 he was married. And when he was enlisted in October 1914, he was 33 years old. He became a gunner with the Royal Field Artillery and was taken prisoner of war during the German Spring Offensive in early 1918. In July 1918, his wife Ella wrote to his regiment in Woolwich.
Sir, could you please tell me anything about my husband, Gunner S.G. Locke, 41480 A Battery RFA. I've had no news from him for over 9 weeks. Trusting you will not mind my writing to you, but I'm worried about him. E. Locke.
Worms, Germany, 18th of October 1918. The Chief Medical Officer of the local Prisoners of War Hospital has notified that Sidney George Locke, Englishman, prisoner of war, Private Royal Field Artillery, farmer, aged 38, born at Drayton, England, died at Worms in the Prisoner of War Hospital following illness on the 18th of October 1918 at 4 a.m.
He's buried at the Hochheim Hill Cemetery in Worms, about 40 miles south of Frankfurt. In this small village, there were around 360 people living in Drayton at the time. No family would have been untouched by this war to end all war. It was a pattern repeated across the country. As well as the 14 men remembered in this film, there were at least 60 other villagers who served abroad and returned. Everybody's lives changed forever at the beginning of the modern age.
It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye Piccadilly, farewell
I am the great-grandson of 5461 Private William Bang of the Prince Albert's Somerset Light Infantry from 1899 to 1915, an original, old contemptible Somerset soldier. 'Tis not this muddy trench I see, but a windy brook in a withy tree in Somerset. The stench of battle is wafted away with sweet apple blossom and new mown hay in Somerset. Cast out the sounds of guns and shells, ring out for me church bells in Somerset. Oh, for a draught of frothy ale from Flagstone cellars, remembered well. Lord, cool my head and my heaty brain. Am I in Flanders or home again in Somerset? 'Tis not this muddy trench I see, but a windy brook and a withy tree in Somerset. 100 years have gone, and I to think of them as I wander free along a windy brook past their withy tree in Somerset. Will you all join me and think of them? Remember well